exact same, I know, isn't that cool? It's the exact same symbol. Now, all by itself, can you say with any kind of absolute confidence, I know what that symbol is when it's all by itself? No, you can't. As soon as it shows up with a 12 on one side and a 14 on the other, you get a pretty good idea, okay, I know what it is, right? When it shows up with an A on one side and a C, you're like, okay, yeah, I know what that is. This is just everyday common sense. If somebody says to you, today's cool, you need context, don't you? I mean, if somebody says, today's cool, so I put on a sweater. Okay, I know what you're talking about. Context sometimes is bigger than that. Sometimes it's what's going on in the situation. If you're reading, the journal of a 14th century meteorologist, and you find the words today was cool, probably does not mean today was wicked sweet, right? On the other hand, if a 14-year-old girl's diary, you're like, yeah, she's probably not making an observation about the temperature range, right? See, that's all part of context. Honestly, if you remember that basic rule, you will be farther along to understanding what the Bible says than anything else I can give you. It's just basic common sense kind of stuff. The problem is that common sense doesn't often apply to the way we look at the Bible. I don't know what we're using, what kind of sense, but it's not common. And so people end up doing strange kinds of things. And so I look at these interpretive attacks where people say, listen, the Bible means anything you want it to mean. And I go, no, it doesn't. It was written by an author. It means something. Let's try to figure out what they meant before we start criticizing it, before we start saying, well, the Bible's wrong about this or about that. I mean, context is important. You get weird statements in the Bible like, oh gosh, if you read the Psalms, it says stuff like, and the sun rose. There you go. The Bible's full of errors. Sun doesn't rise. Primitive idiots. The earth turns. They just didn't know that. But see, that's why I don't trust the Bible, because it's full of these kinds of errors. Yeah, okay, come on. When was the last time you turned on the news and you heard the anchor guy go, well, tomorrow at 5:42 a.m., the earth will rotate into such a position that the sun will become visible over the eastern horizon? Ever? No, what do we say? Sunrise. It's the language that we... Now, would you find that kind of thing in a science textbook? Actually, yeah, you would. Because it's a convenient way of talking. But, it's in the science textbook that you're going to get the explanations exactly what goes on during the sunrise. But that's not what... If you're writing if you're writing a poem to your girlfriend, if your beauty is like the sun rising, it's just not going to rhyme. And it's not going to have good rhythm if you're going to have to somehow work there about the planet rotating and the sun. It's context. It's about what's going on in the situation, about what's going on in the way they describe things at particular times. I don't consider that a good example of the Bible being full of scientific errors, because I understand a basic common sense rule about interpretation. And so these interpretive attacks, I think, fall apart when you begin to use just basic common sense. A lot of the things that people say, well, the Bible's not trustworthy, is because they haven't really understood what it was saying or what it was trying to say. What about these moral attacks? Well, I said these were good, and I do think these are good. Partly I think they're good because they actually give me an opportunity to have some real, genuine conversations with people. I love this one when it comes up, and this comes up on the plane all the time lately. I think people have been reading Dawkins, and so they get this idea about, or Hitchens, they get this idea about slavery, and I love to have this conversation. It doesn't make me nervous in the least. Does the Bible promote slavery? Well, it's an interesting question. I like to point out, listen, hey, if we actually look at what the Bible says about slavery, the first thing that's interesting is there was no slavery in the beginning. But it's not true of most ancient Near Eastern creation stories. The Hebrew concept of creation was written about the same time frame, about the same part of the world, but you get the Babylonian stories and the Sumerian stories and these kinds of things. What's really interesting is if you read the Babylonians and the Akkadians and the Sumerians and their creation stories, there's always a very distinct class of beings. There's the sort of like they're on top and they're the best and they're the kings and the rulers, and then there's the rest of humanity. And of course, guess who is the one who's on the top of the human heap? Whatever story it is. So the Babylonian creation story, the Babylonians are vastly superior to all other peoples. In the Akkadian stories, it's the Akkadians who are the vastly superior ones. But you don't get that in the Bible. In the Bible, you get statements about radical equality of all human beings, regardless of race, from the very beginning. So, for instance, the Bible says that all human beings are created equal. Here's what Genesis says. God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the heavens and the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And so God created man, or humanity, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. In the world. I love PowerPoint. Can anybody fill in the answer? The rest of it?
Male and female.
Male and female are created. And that's the end of the story. Yeah, I don't know what that is, where that came from. According to Genesis, there's just this basic statement that God made humanity. There's no statement of race. All races derive from this first man and woman in the Genesis story, which means that all races are present there at the beginning, and there's no sense of inequality or of superiority. There's just humans. In fact, there's a radical statement about the equality of male and female, which is very, very unusual in this part of the world, this time frame. It's saying man and woman, they're both made as the image of God. They're the same. There's no intrinsic difference of worth between them. It's a very different kind of account than what you find in some of these other stories. Job 31 says the same kind of thing. He says, Job's talking, he says, if I have rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant, in other words, these are people that Job has as what? Maybe. We'll get to that in a second. But for now, that'll work. When they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, well, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? In other words, the one who has a complaint against him, his slave. And did not one fashion us in the womb? In other words, Job is saying, even though I've got man and maidservants, even though I've got slaves, they're equal. In God's eyes, we're all the same because God made us at the same time, and there's no sense of equality or inequality. They're just people. It's a very, very unusual kind of a context within ancient Near Eastern literature, actually, this idea of equality of people. So the Bible clearly does not have this idea of superiority or slavery from the beginning. The Bible, when it was properly understood, led to the abolition of slavery. Make no mistake about it, if you read your history, it was Christians understanding what the Bible actually said that led to the abolition of slavery in the modern world. There was arguments that went back and forth among theologians. And what won out was the argument, listen, you are misunderstanding what the Bible says. Here, look at the context. Here, look at what's going on. And when you look at what's going on, you look at the context, the end result is every human being is exactly the same in terms of their worth. Slavery makes no sense. It was abolished because of the understanding of the Bible. Rather than the Bible promoting slavery, it abolished it. Part of the problem, and one of the things that went on in this debate, is there's a lot of questions about whether or not slave is even the right word. Now listen, if you read the Old Testament, you're going to see the word slave a lot. But there's a huge question among biblical scholars about whether or not that's a good word, whether or not it really makes sense. Part of the reason is, when we look at the original words, it's really more like servant than it is like slave. And part of the problem is that when we think about slave, we have this tendency to think in certain terms and certain images that are really not very biblical. For instance, part of what happens when we think of slavery is we think about early American slavery. And so that becomes the lens through which we look at the idea of slavery in the Bible, and it's really an inaccurate lens. Let me explain what I mean. In the Bible, were slaves allowed days off? Yeah, they were. It was required by law. In fact, if you didn't do it, you were considered a sinner, and you had to make atonement, and you were punished for it. You had to give slaves day off. Was that true in the Roman world? It was absolutely not. No slaves were deserving of days off. Was it true in early American slavery? No. Days off were not required. So right off the bat, the Bible has a very different view of the way they were treating slaves. The Bible requires sufficient food for slaves. That was not true in the Roman world. It was not true in the New World. Did you have legal rights as a slave? According to the Bible, you did. You actually had the same legal rights as the slave owners. That was not the case in the Roman world. It's not the case in early American slavery. Could you get slaves by kidnapping? The Bible expressly forbids that. You could do it in the Roman world. You could do it in the New World. Could you abuse your slaves? Not according to the Bible. Strict regulations against that. But you could in the Roman world and you could in the New World. Why? Because in the Roman world and the New World, slaves were considered property. They were not considered human beings. But because in the Bible, all human beings are equally valuable and worthy in God's eyes, you could not do these horrible things to them because they're not property, they're people. At the end of the day, God actually has a lot to say about slavery. This is one of the most interesting